This video asks a straightforward question: who truly deserves the title most powerful Jedi across Star Wars lore? That question matters because power in the Force-shaped wars defined political outcomes and built the myths fans argue about. The goal here is a calm, evidence-based comparison, not a popularity contest, weighing documented feats and demonstrated capabilities against the varying standards of the stories that gave rise to them. To make that comparison useful, this opening sets a clear rubric. Power will be assessed across 5 categories: raw force potential, innate connection, and midichlorian indicators where applicable, technical skill, lightsaber mastery, force technique variety, and combat proficiency, signature feats, concrete displays like feats of telekinesis, precognition, mass influence, or reality-bending moments, influence and legacy, institutional, political, or doctrinal impact, and scope of source material, separating on-screen canonical evidence from expanded universe legends claims. Contenders will be evaluated against this framework and labeled by source so viewers can judge which standards matter most to them. We'll start by defining, as precisely as practicable, what counts as power in this context. The rubric announced earlier: raw potential, technical skill, signature feats, influence and legacy, and scope of source material, is deliberately broad. Each category measures a different facet of what makes a Jedi formidable. Taken together, they let us compare very different kinds of achievement: the raw genetic or mystical potential behind a being's connection to the Force, the trained ability to use that connection in combat or crisis, the headline moments that prove capability in extreme circumstances, and the institutional or narrative influence that converts individual power into long-term consequence. Finally, we'll make explicit how we treat canonical on-screen evidence versus expanded claims from legends. Below is how each category will be read and applied. 1. Raw force potential. This measures an individual's innate connection to the Force. In practical terms, we include biological indicators like midichlorian counts, the only explicit quantified metric established on screen. Family bloodlines, known for strong force sensitivity, the Skywalkers being the canonical example, and consistent descriptions in text sources that mark someone as unusually force-rich from birth or early training. Raw potential is the ceiling, the latent capacity for feats, but it is not the same as realized power. High midichlorian counts imply tremendous possibility. They don't guarantee skill, judgment, or the will to use that potential reliably. We'll treat potential as necessary context for other measures, not the sole deciding factor. 2. Technical mastery. This covers trained competence, lightsaber forms and proficiency, variety and sophistication of force techniques, tactical adaptability, and demonstrated combat record. Here we look at things that can be observed repeatedly: an individual's ability to handle multiple opponents, to execute advanced or unusual techniques, Mace Windu's Vapad, Yoda's acrobatics and defensive mastery, or mastery of telekinetic precision, and longevity of skill over time. Mastery also includes refined, doctrine-level capabilities such as meditation, force healing, or resisting aggressive influence. In short, this category answers the question: how well does this Jedi use what they have? 3. Signature feats. Signature feats are concrete displays that prove exceptional capability under extreme conditions. These are the moments that become historical and mythic: duels against comparably powerful opponents, feats of mass telekinesis, moving or stopping large objects or vehicles, long-range force projection or illusion, large-scale mind control or persuasion, unique abilities like force-sustained survival in vacuum, or near-reality bending events described in the texts. Examples range from on-screen moments, Yoda's duel with Count Dooku and his later duel with Palpatine, Anakin's destruction of enemy squadrons in combat when piloting skill intersects force-aided reflexes, to legendary acts in the expanded universe, planetary-scale force storms, or ancient Jedi who reshaped locales. When we catalog signature feats, we note whether they are demonstrated on film, in modern canon novels and comics, or only in Legends material, because the same kind of claim carries different evidentiary weight depending on source. 4. Influence and legacy power isn't only measured in one-on-one contests or wonder feats. It is also measured by the scope of change a Jedi imposes on institutions, politics, doctrine, and students. Founders and reformers can be among the most consequential figures precisely because their choices outlive their lifetimes. Influence includes creating or reworking Jedi doctrine, founding orders, training generations of powerful pupils, or decisively shifting political outcomes. Odan-Ur is a useful early benchmark in this category. In Legends, he's remembered not as the single most dazzling duelist, but as a foundational historian and lawgiver who helped shape the Jedi Code and institutional memory, a figure whose impact created standards later generations would be measured against. In modern canon, the High Republic era functions as another institutional benchmark. It presents a period where collective Jedi norms and expectations were being tested and codified, showing how an era's role can influence what counts as powerful behavior for the Order. 5. Scope of sources, canon versus legends. This is not a footnote, it's central. Star Wars storytelling has multiple continuities with different editorial standards. On-screen canon, the films and most recent TV, novels and comics, tends to document fewer, more restrained displays of cosmic power. Legends and earlier expanded universe material were willing to present much larger scales, reality-bending force events, mass miracles, and individuals who could reshape worlds. Both are valid for a comparative survey, but they cannot be treated identically. For a fair comparison, we will always label a claim by its source category, and when feasible, indicate whether a similar display exists in the other continuity. That way, viewers can decide whether to privilege the tightly defined, film-anchored canon or the broader, sometimes mythic legends. Claims when answering the most powerful question: how these categories interact. The categories are interdependent. A high midi-chlorian count gives a Jedi the raw material to execute technically difficult maneuvers and to attempt large signature feats, but without training, the potential may remain unrealized. Technical mastery can compensate for lower innate potential. A well-trained, experienced Jedi can outperform a raw prodigy in many real situations. Likewise, influence and legacy are cumulative. A Jedi who reforms doctrine and trains dozens of masters can be more consequential than one who performs an isolated spectacular miracle. When we evaluate contenders later in the video, each will receive a balanced reading. Potential establishes capacity, mastery shows execution, feats supply proof, and legacy shows lasting effect. Addressing common measurement problems, several practical problems arise when applying any rubric to mythic material. First, source reliability varies. An in-universe chronicle or legend may exaggerate, and older texts sometimes contradict newer ones. Second, narrative needs often determine power portrayal. A scene requires a last-minute miracle, and the script supplies it, so extraordinary acts are sometimes contextual rather than consistent. Third, there's category overlap. A signature feat may create legacy, for instance, a single victory that ends a war. Or technical mastery may itself be a form of influence if it codifies a new combat form. We will not try to eliminate these ambiguities. Instead, we will make them explicit and rate claims transparently, separating Jedi ability from cosmic force entities. Finally, a necessary distinction. Some Star Wars stories introduce quasi-divine force entities or phenomena that exceed what a Jedi, as a practitioner of a tradition and ethical code, normally does. Mortis, the Ones, the cosmic father-daughter-son, or the force-wielding entities of ancient myth are not Jedi in the normal sense, and are not contenders for the title most powerful Jedi. They illustrate different orders of power and will be acknowledged, but kept separate from the list of individual Jedi examined. With these definitions in hand, the comparisons in the next chapters will be both consistent and transparent. Each contender will be evaluated across the 5 categories, with claims tagged by their canonical status. That structure will let us weigh on-screen evidence alongside broader Legends narratives, and it's how the next chapters will present Yoda, Anakin, Luke, Mace Windu, and the legendary figures from the Old Republic era, side by side, assessed against the same set of standards. With the rubric in place, the next step is to apply it to the best documented contenders in modern on-screen canon. The goal is straightforward. Weigh each candidate by the same 5 measures: innate potential, technical mastery, monumental feats, leadership and legacy, and canonical status. Then use that comparison to show where canonical evidence puts the strongest Jedi. The 4 figures that dominate that conversation are Yoda, Anakin Skywalker, Luke Skywalker, and Mace Windu. Each occupies a different slice of what power can mean, and each exposes the limits of judging strength only by spectacular moments. Yoda, innate potential, exceptional. Yoda's species and origins remain mysterious, but his centuries of life, sustained attunement to the Force, and role as Grand Master mark him as having unusually deep, persistent connection. Canon explicitly portrays him as among the oldest and most attuned Jedi. Technical mastery, outstanding. Yoda routinely demonstrates advanced control of telekinesis, precognition, and lightsaber skill. The Clone Wars series expands his repertoire beyond the films, showing combative agility that belies his size, and a calm, refined use of Force disciplines across contexts. Monumental feats. High but measured. Key on-screen feats include lifting and manipulating massive objects. Most familiarly, Luke's X-Wing in the Empire strikes back in a training sequence, surviving powerful confrontations, notably his duel with Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith, and decisive interventions during the Clone Wars. None of these are cosmic-level rewrites of reality. They are precisely the kind of powerful, disciplined application of the Force the Jedi tradition emphasizes. Leadership and legacy. Massive. Yoda's centuries of teaching and his role in shaping Jedi doctrine are central to his power. His influence is institutional as well as individual. Canonical status. Firmly on screen and reinforced by the Clone Wars and other canonical sources. In short, Yoda scores top marks for mastery and leadership, and very high for potential and demonstrated feats. His power is broad, deep, and shaped by restraint. Anakin Skywalker, innate potential, peak. The prequel films explicitly identify Anakin as having an unprecedented midichlorian count, and the narrative frames him as uniquely gifted. That is canonical and central to his claim. Technical mastery, mixed. Anakin is an extraordinary pilot and duelist. His lightsaber work in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, and his development across the Clone Wars, demonstrate elite technique. But his formal training was irregular, and emotional instability undercut long-term refinement. Monumental feats, tremendous, but uneven. On raw ability alone, Anakin exhibits single-moment dominance. Feats of speed, aggression, and improvisational power in the prequels and the Clone Wars are repeatedly foregrounded. Conversely, his decisive failures, his loss to Obi-Wan on Mustafar, and his fall to the dark side, illustrate limits that are as much moral and psychological as they are technical. Leadership and legacy. Complicated. Anakin shaped galactic events more than he led a cohesive Jedi movement. His legacy is paradoxical, the fall that created the Empire, and ultimately, the redemption that ended Palpatine's rule. Canonical status. Strongly canonical, with numerous appearances across films and the animated series. Anakin's case is the clearest example of raw potential, tempered and ultimately undermined by emotional choices. On a purely power capacity scale, he rates extremely highly. As a sustained, reliable practitioner of Jedi ideals, he is inconsistent. Luke Skywalker, innate potential, high. As Anakin's son, Luke inherits a potent connection to the Force. Canon positions him as exceptional, though his youth in A New Hope gives only early hints. Technical mastery evolving. The original trilogy shows rapid growth. By Return of the Jedi, Luke can handle Vader and employ Force-guided combat. His later canonical arc, including training under Yoda and the off-screen rebuilding and teaching of a new Jedi Order, shows development into a true master, though much of that growth is dramatized across novels and comics with varying emphasis. Monumental feats, singular and consequential. The Last Jedi presents Luke's most headline-making canonical feat, an instantaneous, galaxy-spanning force projection that deceives an entire enemy force and momentarily stalls Kylo Ren. That projection demonstrates a form of force power that exceeds what other living Jedi are shown doing on screen. It is, however, costly and strategic rather than a sustained display of raw destructive might. Leadership and legacy. Central in modern canon, whether in the sequel's narrative of failure and recovery or in supplemental media where he rebuilds Jedi training, Luke's influence on future generations and on the idea of what a Jedi can be is enormous. Canonical status, on screen and supported by subsequent canonical books and comics. Luke's strength is a combination: high innate potential, late but decisive technical and philosophical growth, and a flagship monumental feat that demonstrates a different axis of power, projection and will, rather than brute force. Mace Windu, innate potential, above average. Mace has the physical and mental gifts that brought him to the Jedi Council's leadership, though the prequels suggest his strengths are best expressed through discipline and combat training, rather than mystical longevity. Technical mastery, exceptional in lightsaber combat. Mace is credited in canon with creating and mastering Vapad, a form that channels aggressive energy into precise technique. On screen and in related canonical media, he is presented as one of the Order's top duelists. Monumental feats, focused and dramatic. Mace's single most famous on-screen moment is his confrontation with Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith, where he nearly defeats the Sith Lord in an extended duel. His frontline effectiveness across the Clone Wars, shown repeatedly in the films and series, confirms his ability to perform under pressure against multiple opponents. Leadership and legacy. Significant but narrower. As a council member and battlefield commander, Mace's influence is tactical and philosophical. Vapad's risky ethos limited its broader institutional adoption. Canonical status. Solidly on-screen and supported by the animated canon, Mace represents a particular kind of power, combative dominance and philosophical daring. He is less of a cosmic figure than a consummate martial practitioner. Comparative takeaways. When these four canonical figures are placed side by side with the rubric, a pattern emerges. Yoda represents depth and longevity, mastery plus consistent, disciplined feats. Anakin represents apex potential and raw, sometimes uncontrollable power. Luke represents the arc, from potential to mature, creative application of the Force, culminating in a singular, almost mythic feat. And Mace represents technical combat supremacy and doctrinal risk-taking. Two consistent themes deserve emphasis. First, canonical evidence favors precise, constrained demonstrations of power rather than unchecked omnipotence. The films and animated series show exceptional ability, but they frame those abilities in ways that highlight cost, consequence, and restraint. Second, different categories of most powerful point to different winners. Pure potential and raw power tilt toward Anakin. Disciplined, comprehensive mastery points to Yoda. The combination of later personal evolution and a single extraordinary act gives Luke a distinctive claim, and pure combative virtuosity suggests Mace Windu. That ambiguity is deliberate and important. Canon tends to prize responsibility and narrative consequence, which means that raw capacity and sustainable mastery don't always coincide. With these canonical heavyweights evaluated, the next chapter will broaden the field into ancient eras and legends material, where scale, scope, and spectacle expand in ways that complicate any single answer to who the strongest Jedi ever was. When the field widens from modern canon into the Old Republic and expanded universe, the scale of what counts as power expands with it. Legends material deliberately raises the ceiling. Battles become continental or planetary in scope. Rituals and artifacts amplify individual capacity, and several figures are written as operating at a near mythic level. That expansion complicates any single ranking. It also forces a sharper distinction between types of power. Personal mastery versus artifact-fueled dominance, martial skill versus metaphysical influence, because many Legends-era figures excel in one domain, but not necessarily another. Revan is the clearest example of why Legends matters. Introduced in Knights of the Old Republic, Revan's reputation rests on a combination of tactical genius, unusual adaptability, and a career spent on both sides of the moral divide. As a Jedi and later as a Sith Lord, Revan led armies, discovered Lost Force lore, and used technology like the Starforge to build fleets. Those achievements show two things. First, a model of power that mixes strategy, charisma, and applied Force knowledge. Second, how artifacts and institutions can multiply an individual's impact. Evaluating Revan against the rubric from earlier means separating raw Force potential from what was achieved through strategy and external tools. Revan's claim to being the strongest depends heavily on accepting leadership, invention, and use of arcane artifacts as integral to power. Exar Kun and Nomi Sunrider illuminate another pattern in Legends: personalities and narrative extremes. Exar Kun was a prodigiously talented student who embraced Sith teachings and, through sorcery and personality, reshaped events across the Old Republic. He mastered lightsaber combat, Sith alchemy, and techniques that allowed his spirit to persist after death, a kind of posthumous agency rarely seen in the films. Nomi Sunrider, by contrast, is often presented as a uniquely intense Force talent whose emotional expression translated into powerful effects in combat and leadership. Her arc shows how Legends frequently ties power to extraordinary personal traits, charisma, passion, or trauma, with dramatic, sometimes destabilizing results. Those stories highlight why measuring strength purely by on-screen duels misses large swathes of what expanded universe writers treated as Force capability. The Old Republic era also produced characters whose abilities were either amplified by or inseparable from ritual and artifact. Sith lords such as Marka Ragnos, Freedon Nad, and later figures like the Sith Emperor, Vitiate, exemplify power enacted through empire-scale sorcery, rituals that drain life, bind regions to a dark will, or reshape political realities. Vitiate, in particular, is written as performing acts that are effectively reality-altering, absorbing life from entire planets, extending his life across centuries, projecting influence from beyond death. These are not demonstrations of lightsaber technique or precise telekinesis. They are large-scale manipulations of life and death. If the metric is what could alter the fate of millions, such figures place near the top. If the metric is personal, repeatable skill in combat and subtle force use, they don't necessarily dominate. That distinction becomes starker with characters like Darth Nihilus, whose defining trait in Knights of the Old Republic T2 is his force hunger, an ability to consume the force of whole worlds. Nihilus is less a traditional opponent and more a cosmological threat. He reframes power as veracity rather than technique. His inclusion in the debate is a reminder that Legends often blends person and phenomenon, and that some entries are effectively force-level natural disasters. Another trend in Legends is moral ambiguity. Several of the most powerful figures cross the Jedi-Sith divide. Revan and Eula Qdroma began as Jedi and then fell, or returned, in ways that emphasize hybrid approaches to the Force. The result is a recurring pattern. Some of the era's most potent abilities appear where traditional doctrine is abandoned or fused. That's important for ranking because it forces a choice about who qualifies. If the strict category is Jedi only, then figures who spend significant stretches as Sith or who are primarily Sith do not count. If the category is Force user with Jedi training or heritage, the pool grows dramatically. Legends also raises the question of provenance. How much of a feat is the user's alone? Many Old Republic tales hinge on amplifying technologies or rituals, the Star Forge, ancient Sith artifacts, or planet-scale sorcery. Those tools matter. A practitioner who wins a galactic war with the help of an artifact is not automatically equivalent to a solitary master who bends the Force with no augmentation. That returns us to the rubric. Raw potential, technical skill, monumental feats, and legacy must be teased apart from dependence on external powers. Finally, it's necessary to separate Jedi mastery from other forms of Force authority. Legends is full of Force entities and avatars, beings whose existence is ontologically different from a mortal Jedi. The Mortis figures from the Clone Wars arc in modern canon are a canonical example of Force embodiments, and Legends has its own catalog of cosmic beings, abominations like Abeloth, or ancient presences that exercise Force will over entire systems. These entities often eclipse Jedi simply by being made of the Force itself. They are not trained or skilled in the human sense, and so occupy a different category. Similarly, some Legends-era Force phenomena, the aforementioned Nihilus, or persistent Sith. Ghosts, like Exar Kun, are borderline entities, not alive in a conventional way, yet exerting agency. Counting them as the strongest Jedi muddies the definition. Power at that scale is less a question of mastery and more a question of ontology. So what does this chapter of Legends and Ancients change? It multiplies plausible contenders and complicates the meaning of strength. Revan presents a hybrid model. Genius plus adaptability, sometimes aided by artifacts. Exar Kun and Nomi Sunrider show how exceptional personality and ritual change the game. Figures like Nihilus and Vitiate illustrate that some legends' claims push power into a different category altogether. Catastrophic, systemic, and often dependent on ritual or cosmic circumstance, and the presence of Force entities demonstrates that not every powerful Force presence is comparable to a trained Jedi. That variety is precisely the point. When the Old Republic and expanded universe are included, the question who is the strongest Jedi no longer has a single, smooth axis of comparison. It becomes a matrix, what counts as power, which sources count as legitimate, and whether artifacts or cosmic status are allowed. Each choice produces a different champion. The next section will pull those threads together against the rubric established earlier and return to the practical question of weighing canon and legends claims side by side, because any final judgment depends on which of these categories a viewer decides should carry the most weight. In the end, there is no single, unambiguous, strongest Jedi. Measured purely by raw precognition and technique, Yoda sits near the top. Measured by raw, unfiltered potential, Anakin is unrivaled. Measured by legacy building and adaptive use of the Force, Luke earns the claim. Expand the rubric to include strategy, moral ambiguity, artifacts, ritual, or cosmic circumstance, and names like Revan, Exar Kun, Nomi Sunrider, Nihilus, and Vitiate legitimately enter the field. Include Force entities, and the question of ontology and the comparison breaks down further. That plurality is the point. Strength in Star Wars is a matrix, not a single scale. Decide which categories you value: canon only, legends, artifacts, ritual, or systemic power, and a different champion will emerge. Power in these stories measures both capability and the burden it brings. The strongest Jedi, therefore, is as much a narrative choice as it is a factual claim.